Okay, our final speaker in this session is Antoine Jacobsohn. Antoine studied agronomy at Cornell University and then did his graduate work on the history of food production and consumption in France at the University of Paris 8 and at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. In 2004, he began work at the King's Kitchen Garden in Versailles, and in 2007, he became the director of this small 9 hectares part of Versailles. The King's Kitchen Garden is under the auspices of the French National School for Landscape Architecture, a school of higher education of the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. Today, Antoine will speak on seed origins, collecting, breeding, and selling new varieties of fruits and vegetables around Paris at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Please welcome Antoine.
So, this, how many of you, I don't know how many of you actually cultivated fruits and vegetables, but you know that if you reproduce vegetables from seed, generally you don't have them reproduced to type. They change all the time. And the same is true for fruit trees. So it's always interesting for me to hear talking about importing fruits and vegetables or importing plants in, having specimens. But generally, you can talk about botanical specimens, but when you talk about agricultural plants, they're never stable. So this paper is a small part of a larger study of the history of fruit and vegetable breeding. I will start with some elements of general context that have already, in some sense, been given, but I want to try to reframe them for what I will try to do. I will try to consider the specificity of the period, I'd say 1790, 1830, of course, before and after is part of it. And the specificity in terms of the number of fruit and vegetable varieties that can be identified, that are in the texts. And then I will try to briefly present 3 biographies, 3 life histories that have 3 very different understandings, interpretations, comprehensions of what a fruit or vegetable variety represents. So on the left is an anonymous late 18th century painting called the Vegetable Seller, and on the right a portrait of, it's anonymous, it's important, and on the right a portrait by Dumont of Parmentier. Parmentier holds in his hand something that maybe you can recognize. You have some wheat, but especially you have some corn and you have some potato flowers, and that's not just a wink, it's a reference to this Franco-American relationship that we have here today. But what I want to point out is this question between a commercial producer that has very few vegetables, just a few cabbage, 1 bunch of carrots, a bit of onion or garlic, it's not even quite clear, and a researcher, a scientist, a publicist. What is the difference between what they are trying to do? Both have commercial interests. I mean, Parmentier is interested in trying to save the world. Both have commercial interests, both have the common good in mind, but from the point of view of plant breeding, one is in the search of regularity, one is in the search of dependability, while the other is in search of variability, of differences. The producer wants to go to market with something that the buyers are going to recognize. Parmentier wants to get people to have different things in different places. Another element of context, 2 paintings again, one on the left, a peasant woman with a vegetable basket, again late 18th century, again anonymous, and on the right a painting of a young woman carrying a gift of fruit. It's from 1835, it's in the Museum of Nantes, le Musée des Beaux-Arts de Nantes, by Alexandre Jean S. Again in opposition, popular against elite or against versus, I'm not sure it's an opposition in terms of violence, popular, polarity, popular versus elite or peasant versus bourgeois. what I want to point out again here is that the fruit are recognizable. I can more or less identify every fruit variety there. I cannot do that for what's in the vegetable basket. Now, I don't want to get bogged down myself in the details of the two tables I'm going to show you, but I could have done the entire talk on this one or the next one. But I just want to point out a few little things as quickly as I can. It's obviously incomplete. It's only a selection of what are more or less the most important texts about vegetable varieties in the late 17th to the early 19th century. You'll notice in between the fifth and the fourth and the fifth column a change in dates. It's not quite chronological. 1690 to 1785 are all horticultural texts meant to be, how to say, vulgarization or diffusion of information. The two last columns are two catalogs of a seed producer. They're not quite the same kinds of texts. What I really want to point out on the bottom line is that we don't have very much for these three, species, cabbage, beans, and lettuce. If we, in 1690, only 25 are mentioned, but when we get to 1749, 1785, and then suddenly in the beginning of the 19th, it explodes. What happens? What is this about? Why do vegetable varieties suddenly get described? There's really a date. 1749 is the most important date. It's the first time that we have real descriptions of vegetable varieties. Jean-Baptiste Lacantini is wonderful, creator of the Potager du Roi, the King's Kitchen Garden in Versailles, but he simply gives you a list of lettuce varieties. We don't have a description, there's just a name. De Comble in 1749 is the first one to actually describe, and we can actually compare his description to varieties that have the same name today. Just wanted to point out that explosion, and I wanted to point out in that explosion of numbers of fruit varieties the difference between a vegetable catalog selling on the market seeds in 1778, which is far less than what De Comble or Le Berrier describes. I admit that it's why these three, I know I was going to get bogged down on this, but too bad. Why these three? Why cabbage, beans, lettuce? And I think this is very important. Cabbage and lettuce are necessarily cross-pollinating. They can't pollinate themselves. In other words, when you reproduce from seed, you necessarily have something that's different from what you planted. Beans are a bit simpler, and again, it's the Franco-American connection. Beans are self-pollinating. The flower pollinates itself before it opens. You can keep them true to type far more easily. And it just so happens that beans are the first vegetable variety collection that I've ever met. The first time I've ever known someone or found in the text a person who collects a vegetable variety is in the text from De Comble, 1749. He mentions a collector of beans. Let's look at something similar for fruit. More or less the same authors, but not quite, and more or less the same kind of situation in terms of the fact that the last document, only the last document in this case, is a half catalog, half book of a nurseryman, Louis Noisette. Different story, though. A large number of varieties at the end of the 17th century that seem to diminish or seem to be reduced for a certain period, and then explode at the end. Again, what happens? Actually, that we were touching here the difference between the fruits and vegetables that I kind of wanted to mention for the woman's vegetable basket and the young woman carrying the fruit. Generally, fruit are reproduced by grafting, so they're reproduced asexually. And we have a huge increase in the number of fruit varieties described in the 17th century. And in the 18th century, they seem to want to reduce it. They don't know what to do with this huge mass of information. But behind these two things, there's something that does change. What changes is the knowledge that people have at the time of why it varies. Sébastien Vaillon at the Jardin du Roi, I shouldn't say Jardin des Plantes, the King's Garden, in Paris, describes sexuality at the end of the sexuality of plants at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. Linnaeus makes it a central part of the description or the difference between varieties and species in the middle of the 18th century. But what goes on for most people? Because one of the things I've noticed, and that's very important part of this paper for me, in terms of the work I try to do in Versailles, is that most people know that plant sexuality exists, but not many people know how it functions. And it's very interesting to see how these three men dealt with plant sexuality, because they didn't understand the same thing. And I don't think that most people today understand yet the same thing. So Duchesne, Le Lieur, who was mentioned this morning already, and Antoine Poitou. Duchesne is very well known because he seems to have understood everything before everyone else. He created a genealogy. In some sense, it's the systematics of strawberries. And again, it's a Franco-American connection, because he's the person who first described what we consider to be the modern strawberry, Fragaria X ananassa, which is what we consume all the time, which is a cross between two New World strawberries that occurred in Europe. It's not a cross that happened in the Americas, it's a cross that happened in Europe, and he's the first person to describe it. He's not the one who did it. But what happens is he gets interested in this because after working with Bernard de Jussieu at the Trianon Gardens, he has a few things in his garden, and he notices the strawberry plant on the left. A strawberry plant that only has one leaflet rather than three. And he writes a letter to Linnaeus, at the age of 17 he writes a letter to Linnaeus saying, can we create a new species? Is this a new species or not? Because Linnaeus is a fixist, has said that all plants are created by God initially. Sexual reproduction exists, but the consequences of sexual reproduction aren't understood. Duchesne at the age of 17 seems to understand. He says, well, I have a new species here. It's not the same thing. It reproduces true to type. What do I do? This is just a picture of the same plant in the King's Kitchen Garden in Versailles today. What's really interesting about the strawberries is that it's immediately linked to commercial production. In other words, Duchesne is going to do lots of crosses. He's not going to actually do emasculation and pollination himself, but he's going to put different plants next to each other. He's going to discover that the reason for which the Fragaria chiloensis it flowered but didn't have fruit, was that it was dioecious. It was the male and female flowers on different plants. And so he's going to put a male plant of a French strawberry next to a female plant of a Chilean strawberry, and he's going to get a cross. And that's how he gets to analyze the Fragaria X ananassa, the two American ones. But what's interesting is that 4 years after he does these experiments, the same plants will be found in the Andrieux seed catalog. In the 1770s, so he does this in 1760, I always forget the dates, I'm very bad on dates. He does this in the 1764, 1765. But he goes, after strawberries, he goes on, and he doesn't just work on strawberries, he works on squash. And what's bizarre is that the squash never make it to the Villemorin or the Andrieux seed catalog. And I don't know why yet. But he does the exact same work on squash, and he will be the first describer, Peppo, though, so I don't know if you know this. Here I go, sorry guys. There are 3 squash species, okay? Linnaeus has one, Cucuberta Peppo, and Duchesne is going to describe the 2 others. So he's going to be the first describer of 2 species, the Cucurbita moschata and the Cucurbita maxima. In other words, he's doing experiments of crossbreeding. He's knowing which ones cross and which ones don't. And he's getting differences. And with the squash, it's really fascinating. There's been a relatively recent publication of all these drawings. There's over 300 of them in the Bibliothèque Centrale du Muséum by an Israeli researcher who's actually from New Jersey. He follows the different generations. He does drawings of the different years, and they change all the time. And I think that's one of the reasons they don't make it to the seed catalog. The strawberries do, because they get reproduced by stolons and sometimes by seed. Most importantly, for what I wanted to tell you today, is that Duchesne is very aware of the difference that I described initially between the researcher and the producer. And in this page, which I will not translate, what he says is that the practice of crossing plants is specific to the amateur, specific to the researcher, to the curious, while the producer is interested in having something stable. Duchesne has fully understood how sexuality of plants function. He describes the dioeciousness of different species of strawberries. He describes the fact that on squash plants, female flowers and male flowers are on the same plant, but they're separate. He's understood how things function. Le Lieur is going to be my next, and what's a supplemental comment on Duchenne. He starts the same kind of work on potatoes, and then seems to just let plants drop, and he goes on to other things in natural history. Le Comte Le Lieur. Le Comte Le Lieur is a rather funny story for us today because he's a count. He goes into exile in 1791, 1792, and ends up in New Jersey. Gets married to a woman from Princeton and goes back to France with collections of peaches, apples, corn, sweet potato, and potatoes as well. But that's not what he's known for today. What he's known for today is being one of the first dahlia breeders, one of the first breeders to have double dahlias, and for a single rose, which he tried to use to rehabilitate himself because he was a fundamental Bonapartist. And when in 1815, 1816, he really worked on rose breeding, and he named his first rose the La Rose du Roi, the King's Rose, but it didn't work. He still got laid off. And it's very interesting about the rose because it's the only rose he created, but it's a very famous rose because it's the first rose qui est remontante. I don't know how to say that in English. Qui est remontante. It's the first flower it's the first rose that reflowers, that doesn't only flower in June. It's the first European rose, the first rose bred in Europe that flowers, because there are other ones. There's Noisette in Louisiana and Charleston. There are other places, but the first one bred in Europe. What he's best known for is actually what's behind. That's a peach tree. He's the first person to really try to redo the principles of fruit tree shapes as La Cantigny and Le Berrier described them, to show that you can do regular shapes even with peach trees, because people didn't think you could before then. We're going to try to talk about his. I had to include this because I think this is a wonderful story. On the left-hand side is a painting by Poitou, who I'm going to talk about very soon, of a fruit brought back by Le Lieur that he called Josephine, that's now called Belle Joséphine, and that has become what's considered a traditional variety of eastern part of Paris. So brought back in 1803, 1804, and become now a local French variety. More importantly, what does Le Lieur understand about sexuality of plants? Actually, not much. He doesn't think, he knows that the pollen is out there. He knows that it creates variability, and actually it bothers him. He's very happy with roses because when you get double roses, the double petals actually replace the anthers. So he knows that on double roses, he should get seeds that are at least not from that plant. I mean, or they're not from, in terms of the male, so he should have less variability. But actually, Le Lieur is convinced, like other people still are, that the basic influence is the graft. It's not the pollination. Pollination just adds noise. But it's the graft that transfers much of its capabilities, much of its characteristics to the seed of the fruit tree. And he does this experiments, I haven't been able to identify the place, but around Princeton, where he has a whole series of experiments with peach trees, and the color of peach is red, white, or star shapes of red within the peach. What he actually does for his fruit variety creations is just sow seeds, let them grow, and try to select from them. He's not the best known person for this. Someone else called Van Mons is, and Van Mons is going to be a very important topic for Poitou if I let myself talk about it. Wanted to mention again on Le Lieur, as with Duchenne, and this is the second part of the quote, they're actually from the same page, and this is again something in terms of how we function today. People complain today that fruit producers always have the same varieties. Le Lieur points out that the fruit producers around Paris don't have many varieties because they weren't regularly producing varieties. And if you want a good fruit, you have to go to someone who has a collection. because the fruit producers aren't interested in good fruit. They're interested in productive trees. And most of the trees that are productive have mediocre fruit. It's kind of the same today. But it was also that way then. So how long has the debate been going on? A blank page. It's because I couldn't get a picture of what I wanted to show you. So I'm going to try to describe it to you. It's in his book on roses, Rudiel's book on roses from 1811. And he goes on and on about breeding roses and that he can apply it to fruit trees. And it's really a fascinating diagram that he makes, because it is the diagrams, the kind of diagram that plant breeders use today to try to function, which kind of characteristics will go from one to the other. The difference between his diagram and how it's done today is his diagram is all about grafting. It's about grafting different plants on different rootstocks to try to influence the seed. And so he's not functioning with the pollen. Let's go on to Poitou. Poitou is, in some sense, he's in the shade of Redoute. He's in the shadow, that's it, of Redoute and of his perhaps more artistic colleague Turpin. But he's very well known for this huge book of over 300 fruit varieties that is a redone version of Duhamel. It's a very complicated story in terms of the different versions of this book. I didn't mention this to you yet. One of the groupings of these three people that I realized after actually working on them was that they all have a relationship to the King's Kitchen Garden in Versailles. One was head of the botanical garden there during the Revolution. The second one succeeded him and in terms of the imperial gardens. And the third one came and drew peaches when he was head of the nursery for Versailles. This is a peach drawn by Poitou. Poitou is an incredible describer. He ends up in San Domingo in Haiti. He comes through the States in the middle of the first decade of the 19th century, somewhere in 1804, 1805, before going back to France. And I forgot to mention this as well. He learned to read and write at the age of 24 by, in part, reading Linnaeus. He was the son of a peasant. But what's important here is that when he goes, he has Linnaeus' book with him. He succeeds in identifying everything that's American in it, but everything that's not identified, he describes. And he comes back with over 600 specimens, and of which over 100 mosses and 30 lichens and 30 mushrooms are identified as new descriptions. He's someone you find, his POIT, that little abbreviation, is often found on a certain number of American plants because he's the first person to describe some of them. He's one of the ones who did drawings for Humboldt and Bonpland's books on plants from Mexico. Anyway, the important part is the botanical section. He's someone who learned gardening with André Toin, but originally with the market gardeners around Paris. Poitou doesn't know what to do with plant sexuality either. It gets him confused. But what he does notice is that species are more stable than varieties. But even species don't reproduce true to type. And in a class that he did in 1830 for the first French horticultural school, l'Institut Royal d'Horticulture de Fromont, linked to the magnolias of Josephine, because Solange Baudin, le Chevalier Solange Baudin, is the creator of this school, and he's one of the first describers of the magnolia tree. In his classes for this institute, Poitou says that everything degenerates. Nothing is stable. We try to describe them. The only thing that's stable is grafting, because he says I can take the description of a pear variety by La Cantini, compare it to what I know today, and it's the same. But for all the rest, I don't know what to do with it. What's incredible is that Poitou is at the head of the diffusion of all new varieties, because he takes over the Bon Jardinier, so the oldest continuously produced almanac about gardening in France. He takes it over somewhere in 1825, I think, 24, with Villemorin, where I'm going to talk about very quickly. So he's head of this publication that is continually talking about new plants. And he's going to spend his time describing plants in terms of types, in terms of species, but almost never in terms of varieties. He's going to try with fruit trees. He's going to have a whole discourse about Van Mons, about how to get new varieties on fruit trees. I'm not going to go too much into because I'm getting hypoglycemic. He also takes over the horticultural, La Revue Horticole, that's founded in 1830, and this is, I think, the second or third feuillet, the second or third, how do you say this in English? Number that comes out. It's a journal. This is the second or third numéro, number. And it begins with information to a nurseryman. How to do your catalog, how to put prices in your catalog. So it's very strange to have this man who thinks that everything degenerates, who's also the same one who's continuously showing what new people are doing. I wanted to end with a few comments about sellers. Sorry. This is the first catalog of the La Maison Andrieux. Andrieux is the beau-père, the father-in-law of Villemorin. Villemorin is the first Villemorin way is the most important seed house in France. And in some sense, it's still one of the most important seed houses in the world, though it's become a trademark, part of a larger company. Very important is that in this catalog, there are fruit trees. It's not just seeds. But it's also seeds and plants. That's what you have on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you have the cover for what I just showed. And on the right-hand side, you have I put them on top of each other so I didn't have to show too many slides. You have an 1856 version of the description of vegetable plants, of vegetables, that's on top of Les Plantes Potagères, which is what everybody knows. But everybody knows the older version, which comes out as a first edition. But the Description des Plantes Potagères is actually the pre-edition of his description of vegetable plants. And it's what I used to show that explosion of seed of vegetable varieties in my first table. But Villemorin is not the only one. He's the one who's best known. There is a sort of steady increase of nursery catalogs, but certainly of nursery catalogs, but not really of seed catalogs. This is one of the rare seed catalogs we have. On the left-hand side, a version from 1805, although on the right-hand side, for a version, an edition that's from 1867, I think, it's mentioned that the house, the company was created in 1796. I have not yet been able to find a seed catalog from before 1805 for the La Maison Tollard. Let me just look at my notes and make sure I haven't gone through anything too quickly. This is my before-last image. Seed catalogs, reproducing seeds. The first book that describes how to reproduce seeds more or less true to type. In other words, which plants have to be separated, which ones you can leave next to each other, dates from 1867. So again, one has to realize that although I'm talking about selling, what most people are interested in, what most producers are interested in, is having a few select varieties, not having a multitude. And so that the whole question of collecting and selling is two different worlds. To end on this, what I've noticed is that if you look at local varieties in France around commercial producers, you almost never have two varieties of the same species from any locality. Well, what all the researchers are doing, all the collectors are doing, are putting lots of different varieties of the same species in the same place. We really have a conflict between the interests of one group and the interests of the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. Any questions specifically for Antoine? Yes.
So because of those thoughts on degeneracy of plants once they come into cultivation, was there a feeling like new plants perpetually needed to be coming in then? And would that then provide an increased role for the botanist, for the explorer, for the collector, because of that perception of the degeneracy? That you always needed new things to revive the cultivars?
I don't know. What's clear is that everyone is continually cultivating. And no one is too strong a word. On certain species, they know how to do things. On certain, they don't know. But again, I think there's also how do things change? Again, the collector is going to bring new things in because they're always trying to have new things. That's part of what they're trying to do. When Chaptal defends the creation of the collection of grape varieties at the Luxembourg during the, I forget the dates in the Revolution, he justifies it on economic reasons. We have to have new things, we have to bring them in because we have to know them so we can redistribute them. The producer only brings in new varieties when they lose theirs. So I'm not sure, again, it depends on who we're talking about. I'm sure that the collectors are worried about degeneration and want to add new things. And I'm sure the cultivators don't worry about it for as long as they succeed in maintaining stable what they have.
Yes.
You mentioned that all of these people had a contact to the Potager du Roi. So were they all living in Versailles? And were they competing with the Jardin des Plantes, or how are they working as like a separate scholarly and productive community? Is there a...
They all lived in Versailles at one time or another. Duchesne is from Versailles, lived in Versailles, died in Paris at his daughter's, I think, in 1827, but he essentially lived in Versailles his entire life. Le Lieur came to Versailles in 1804 and spent quite a bit of time in Saint-Cloud before really settling in Versailles and somewhere in around 1810, and then stayed in Versailles until he died somewhere in, I forget what the date was, 1848 or 1852, something like that. So he lived most of his life, or most of the second part of his life, 30 years or so in Versailles. Poitou only spent 2 to 3 years in Versailles, but regularly visited the King's Kitchen Garden. I like your question. Duchesne is a student of Jussieu and models, when the botanical garden that was installed in the King's Kitchen Garden in the 1790s is installed on the recommendation of Thoin and using a certain number of relationships with Thoin in terms of which collections they have. Le Lieur isn't interested in botanical collections, and he's remarkable in terms of his practical attitude, but I don't know how to say it. Most people who worked with him hated him. He writes the first unique treatise on tree sickness, on sur la maladie des arbres fruitiers. I don't know how to translate that either. But the King's Kitchen Garden is a kind of, has its ups and downs. There was a time where research more or less was being done there, but in relationship with the Jardin des Plantes in Paris during the Revolution, there's this kind of opposition. Le Lieur doesn't follow, and Poitou doesn't really function in the the garden. King's Kitchen Garden is basically a center of production. It's not really a place where plants were studied. It participated, it exchanged, but it wasn't a place of botany or of most of the time of fundamental research.
Okay, thank you for this interesting contrast between stability and variety. My question is, you know that Jean-Antoine Chaptal was the Minister of Interior in the early 19th century, and he was a chemist. And as a chemist, he was extremely concerned with stability. And there were lots of efforts from chemists to get stabilized products and standardized products, and they designed a lot of tests for standardization. And in the case of chemical products, the concern was with first the risk, because when you don't have, as you know, chemicals are dangerous, and also because there was patenting. The first patent in France was for Leblanc's product. But how can you account for the concern for stability with plants in the commerce, in agricultural commerce? Why did consumers, require stable products rather than ever-changing products, new products. Because there was no patents in seeds, there was no risk. So why is it that there was this desire for stability rather than desire for variety?
I like that question too. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it though. I think most people look for stability. Whether they want it or not is a different question. Again, that goes back to my two images of between peasants, between I'd say popular culture and elite culture, between peasant and culture and bourgeois culture. We are talking about a society that's still afraid of not eating. We're talking about a society where most people are not, or go through periods of time where they're not having enough to eat. So the stability is a search for abundance. What we want is a plant that produces regularly every year a lot. If it's good, tant mieux. If it's not, too bad. And that's how I would link it. But what I'm interested in is why would, in terms of your question, is the search for stability in terms of chemistry, and how that has to do with the understanding of how natural phenomena function. Because in French, that term l'ensemencement works both in chemistry and in plants, in terms of how you can crystallize. And I don't know. I try to follow that just as I guess maybe it's a wordplay, but I think maybe there's more to it than that. I think, in terms of plants, that the discovery of plant sexuality had a real influence about suddenly realizing that you could control it. Not necessarily that they succeeded in controlling it, but that you could try to. Duhamel de Monceau in the 1720s, I think it's his second article at the Académie des Sciences, is about a pair. It's about pair grafting, but it's about also the fact that natural species, wild species are stable, cultivated varieties are not, and what can we do about it? And so and it's really linked to Sébastien Vaillant and pollination, and that's what the whole 18th century goes on in terms of plant breeding, is about how to deal with that, how to, in some sense, and from an economic point of view, produce regularly.
We'll take one more, and then we'll invite the other speakers to come to the stage, please.
Lamarck was a botanist before he was a zoologist and a transformist, and related to what you just said about natural species and cultivated species, I seem to recall Lamarck says at one point, we botanists, we really study the natural species, and whatever a horticulturalist develops in terms of a beautiful rose or something, that's very interesting, but that's not what we do. Yet Duchenne, as a disciple both of Jussieu and, you say, Twain, he seems to be following a new path. And then you finally get to Poitou when he's talking about degeneration of type. Does his work ever get related back to, let's say, the scientists who are looking at natural species, and do they take an interest in it? Or can you follow part of this wandering question and maybe talk first about Duchenne and then talk about the relation between some of your later people and maybe somebody like a Lamarck type who was more saying that the real scientist, the real botanist is not playing with these kinds of developments that come through the horticulturalist?
I don't remember Lamarck saying that, but I'm happy to hear it, because the person that generally one refers to in terms of saying that is Linnaeus. Linnaeus says I don't want to hear about varieties. It just doesn't interest me. The only thing that interests me is the species. I mean, that's the whole basis for his, as you know, his binomial system. Duchenne is actually, that's what Duchenne's interested in. It just so happens to be, there's a debate among a certain amount of people, not that many, but a few, about why strawberries and why squash. But basically what Duchenne is interested in is that. He wants to be able to distinguish between a species and a variety. He wants to know what's what. I mean, am I supposed to call this, the strawberry from Montreuil, am I supposed to call it a new name in Linnaeus' system, or am I supposed to call it, Fragaria vesca, like I think? I mean, what do I do? And what always gets me confused about Duchenne is that he stops all of a sudden. And his work on squash is published by Lamarck in the L'Encyclopédie méthodique botanique. I mean, that's in, I think, I can look up the date, but I'm very bad at dates. In the 1790s. Poitou. I haven't worked enough on Poitou to really be able to answer you, but that's something I'd like to do. I want to try to understand why Poitou has this ambivalent relationship to what he does. Because on the one hand, he has this botanist's attitude, and on the other hand, he's totally immersed in the fashion of new plants. And I don't know what to do with him yet.
Okay, thank you.